So it's just past midnight, and I'd intended to make this video a little earlier, but it doesn't really matter. Today is 13th of August 2014, well, just turned the 14th, and it's a poignant date in British history which has received minimal press attention because obviously there's a lot of other things going on in the news, but it's poignant for one particular reason, and that is it is exactly 50 years, half a century, since the last executions in this country, the last men to be hanged with capital punishment in the United Kingdom. They were two young unemployed men, Gwynne and Peter Anthony Allen, and their crime was robbery, murder. The significant thing about this is that at the time it was so insignificant. No one believed at the time these would be the last executions. The murder itself wasn't seen as particularly exceptional, although it was certainly a brutal murder. Basically these two stole a vehicle from Preston and killed the victim, and I don't tend to give all the details of the crime here, but they killed the victim, 53-year-old John West, I believe he was a taxi driver, in his home in Seaton in Cumberland, and by all accounts it was a pretty brutal murder. They beat him to death. The thing is with these two, there was no miscarriage of justice, there was no serious doubt on their case. It's very likely that they were guilty of the crime of which they were condemned to die. There was no last minute reprieve from the Home Secretary of the time, Henry Brooke, who was a Conservative. This was under the administration of Sir Alec Douglas-Home. So it was Britain's last executions, and they took place simultaneously at 8 AM at Walton Prison in Liverpool and Strangeways Prison in Manchester. I think it was Allen was executed in Liverpool and Evans was executed in Manchester. They took place simultaneously. It's also my understanding that they knew the victim. So at the time it wasn't a major story. I believe it only made a few sentences in the Daily Mirror and the Times, because people had anticipated there would be more executions. At this time, this wasn't a case of, okay, these guys are going to be executed and then that's it. The death penalty was still in force. In fact, it was another 3 years. I believe it was 1967, maybe even 1969, that it was actually abolished in statute. And there was many cases in the 60s that came close to being the death penalty, basically. But the report on the BBC says that they were there was 3 judges involved in this case. I'm sorry, I've lost the page now, but I'll put a link to that. Yeah, they had an appeal by Lord Chief Justice Lord Parker of Waddington, Mr Justice Wynne and Mr Justice Widgery, and that appeal did not go ahead. They were sentenced to death, and as such they became the last men to hang in Britain. They were 21 and 25 years respectively, so they weren't very old. But by all means it seems likely that they were guilty of the crime for which they were charged. So these guys were no angels. They committed a pretty heinous crime. They brutally beat a man to death out of greed. I want to talk a little bit about the wider implications of the death penalty in this country, and just generally speaking. I don't want to talk in detail about the history of it because I've already made rather comprehensive videos about that, but this is something I've given a lot of thought to, and it's something that I can honestly see both sides of the argument. I'm talking about the death penalty. My instinct still sways towards being against the death penalty. I don't think I can be someone who's passionate about human rights and then support capital punishment. And before people jump to conclusions, if you're a conservative, if you believe in capital punishment, I would ask you just to hear me out. Because believe me, I am no bleeding heart when it comes to crime, although I don't particularly like that term, but I use it just in this context because it is a word used to symbolize so-called softness on crime. Now, I am not someone who regards myself as liberal on crime. In fact, I would call myself conservative, not party conservative, but socially conservative on crime. I believe people should face the consequences of what they've done. And there are certain crimes, for example, child murder, arson involving deaths, terrorism, whereby it's very easy to understand why people would believe that the death penalty is justified. Why should someone who has committed such an evil act be allowed to live whilst their victim has died? That is the basic understanding. And the thing is, it's they would agree, well, it doesn't bring the victim back. They would actually agree with that, the relatives. But when I look at recent executions in the US, these botched executions, there's something very barbaric about that. Regardless of what they have done, my core feeling is that it reduces society to the level of the criminal. Or actually, I shouldn't word it that way, it reduces the government to the level of the criminal. I don't want to blame society for the acts of criminals, so I don't want to go down that line, but if we kill people to say that killing is wrong, that is clearly hypocritical. I don't see any fundamental difference between the government killing someone through execution, and you can argue that it is more humane than the way the killer has done it. You know, in some cases they may have tortured the victim to death. And you might think, well, what's that compared to getting your neck broken quickly? But in the end of the day, killing is killing. And there is a lot of ways to look at it. Number one is a deterrent argument. There's this sort of myth in Britain today that when we had the death penalty, we were a very safe society, and there was never crimes, or if there was, criminals would automatically be caught and executed. There's this sort of notion that that was the case. Well, going back to the days of public executions in the 18th century, crime was actually rampant. And when there was public executions, crime actually increased, because you had vast crowds, and that actually increased the chances of pickpockets and so on. Obviously I'm talking about petty crime, but there was violent crime as well in those days. The truth of the matter is, crime has always been with us. So this notion that it's only got bad in recent decades is not quite accurate. Among other things, the population has got much bigger. In the mid-60s, I believe Britain's population was somewhere around 40 million, maybe a bit more. Today it's 64 million. So if people point out, oh, look at how many violent crimes there are today, you have to put it in context of population. My instinct is we're actually better than the 90s, but that's not here or there. It's just an instinct I can't prove that. But regarding the death penalty, I am not oblivious to the fact that when a victim, that is someone's relative, has seen their loved one killed at the hands of a callous thug, it is entirely understandable that they would want that person to die, or it's an entirely human instinct. I mean, if someone I loved and cherished dearly had their life taken in the most stupid way, i.e. in a robbery or because of the greed of the person who'd done it, and especially if that person showed no remorse, I honestly believe that I would want them to see them dead. But the question here is, should emotions alone dictate justice? And I don't think they should. Having said that, I do think we have too many situations where there is judges living, frankly, in on another planet, and they cannot see people put before them in the dock clearly need a sentence that fits a crime. Now, there was a woman recently who was let off a custodial sentence despite almost blinding a man, and she had 18 convictions for violence, and yet she was let off a custodial sentence. Obviously that's not going into the realm of what would merit the death penalty in the past, but it's an example of leniency that drives the public absolutely mad, and understandably so. It drives me mad, those sort of things, and there's many, many more examples of that. When judges that these sort of thugs off like that, or when they don't get a custodial sentence when very clearly the case merits a custodial sentence, it's infuriating. And then when you see some people on the left and certain groups like the Hard League for Penal Reform try and make excuses for it, or it's just, I think they have a massive lack of understanding of the mental anguish that relatives go through. And then that in itself is a point worth commenting on, because not everyone feels the same way. There are people who have been victims of crime who would still be on the political left and would still be of a more liberal persuasion. There's victims of crime who are right-wingers. Crime is indiscriminate. Anyone can be a victim of crime, so that is an important thing to point out. Obviously, if you live in a rough inner city area, the chances are higher, but anyone can be a victim of crime. The point I want to make here is, I regard myself as conservative. I believe people who terrorise society should face the full force of the law, and the law should reflect what they have done proportionately. But I don't believe the law should be revenge, and I do regard the capital punishment as bordering on revenge. I believe it is state-level killing. In which case, is there really a difference between that and what would happen in a dictatorship? That is a moral question that needs to be asked. Also, the international trend is against the death penalty. A majority of nations now do not use it, and even some countries that do use it very rarely. There's only actually a handful of countries that use it abundantly. That is China, Iran, the United States. I believe they're the three leading countries. China alone executes, I believe, more people than the rest of the world combined. The US gets a lot of scrutiny because it's one of only 2 democratic countries, along with Japan, that still use it. I know India has argued about bringing it back for its rape crisis, and that's understandable. Mexico has argued about bringing it back. There are situations where there's certain crime epidemics, and people have argued about it coming back, and that of course has been the case in Britain many times. But even right-wingers in this country have argued against it. There's no evidence that it will reduce crime, and I believe that if we bring it back, we will be in no position to lecture any other country. For example, we could never talk to China about human rights if we then bring back the capital punishment, which is state-level killing. Now, I know there's people on the right that scoff at the idea of human rights and would say, oh, you're feeling sorry for the criminal. It's not about feeling sorry for them. It's about wider standards. It's about having values as a society that doesn't reduce us to taking a human life, which is basically what it is. Whatever way you argue it, capital punishment is killing. That's the way it is. Now, if you want to get really philosophical, then you could say, okay, well, soldiers are licensed to kill, essentially. A soldier goes into a war zone, kills another combatant. He or she is licensed to kill. And yet, as a society, we don't frown upon that. We consider they're doing their job. A police officer facing an armed terrorist would have to make the decision to shoot that person. As we know, sometimes it's went wrong. I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but the point I want to make is it becomes a real philosophical question about life and death. And the question is someone's actions, no matter how heinous they are, is that then a justification for taking their life? Does that make the government any better? I mean, I think most people, if you have someone like a child killer, a remorseless child killer, I think most level-headed people would have nothing but disgust and contempt at that sort of person. And if you were overly sympathetic to them, you'd be a bit strange, to say the least. And certainly, I know if someone took away a loved one of mine, I would want their blood. So that's why I'm very, very reluctant to judge people who call for the death penalty who have directly been affected by extreme crime. Because who are we who oppose the death penalty to judge the pain that they have been through, the mental anguish that they have been through? And you need to reflect that their feelings about that are entirely understandable. And sometimes there's people on the left that irritate me because I don't think they really understand the mental anguish that crime puts people through. So not to go off on a tangent, to go back to the original point here, I still, having looked at both sides of the argument, and I do believe there's valid arguments on both sides, I just don't believe that we should go back to those days when we had the death penalty. I believe it would be a step back to a dark time in this country, and I believe it would brutalise society. The film Pierpoint, by the way, if you ever get a chance to see it, I think it's Timothy Spalding as the main actor in that. It's a very powerful film, and it really does show how public sentiments change, for example, from the 1940s to the 1960s. And it's a film that's really worth watching. Pierpoint was he was in fact Britain's last hangman. He is credited, if you want to put it that way, with over 400 executions. I think in the United States, especially in Texas, it's overused. And it's not that some of the people that get executed, you could argue they deserve it. There's this thing about deserving it, and certainly the most heinous crimes, frankly speaking, they probably do deserve it. But is it about deserving it, or is it about justice? Because I don't see those two things as the same. Deserving it is basically revenge. It comes down to an animalistic sort of attitude. Person A done this, so person B is going to do the same thing to person A. You know, the argument goes, prison is a life of luxury. That's very naive. Imagine spending the rest of your days behind bars, and especially in high security prisons, especially in the US, where they don't have perks, not in the same way that they would in the UK. Incidentally, I think that is something that is exaggerated by the tabloids, because if prison was such a luxurious existence, then why is it that the ratio of inmate suicides is much higher than those who are not incarcerated? So if they have such a life of luxury, I don't think they'd be killing themselves. And as much as I have hatred for people who terrorise society, I do not want to see a prison system that is brutal. What I want is a prison system that is tough, not inhumane. And there is a difference. I don't want a Scandinavian style prison system, which in my opinion is a joke. But likewise, I don't want to see a sort of prison system that is like countries whereby they're basically all thrown in together and you see rats running around. And you need something that is clearly punishing the inmate because they're there for a reason, but is not inhumane. And I believe that is an underlying point about justice. So for the most heinous crimes, I would say one thing as a caveat. I do think there may be an argument for capital punishment for the most heinous crimes of all. For example, child murder, mass child murder, mass terrorism. I do think there may be an argument for capital punishment in those cases. But the problem is, where do you draw a line then? How do you define exactly who should be executed and who shouldn't? And it becomes very dangerous territory, and that's why it makes more sense to either have it outright or not have it. To have it just for some cases can be a little bit, I think that could be legally complicated. So my core feeling about this is that we should not go back to those days. I certainly would not welcome that. Regardless of the rights and wrongs, I would not welcome it under any context. Even if I changed my mind about this and said, okay, we should bring it back, it is not something I would be happy about. It's not something I would glorify. And sometimes I do think there is a slightly sadistic side to. I sometimes look at Daily Mail comments and I feel rather sickened. And this isn't coming from a namby-pamby lefty. Like I say, I regard myself as fairly right-wing on crime, but I see some of the comments that are borderline sadistic, and I'm thinking, really, if you honestly believe the things that you're saying, then you're no better than the criminal. So, I don't think we should go back to those days. But I do believe that justice needs to reflect the crime, and far too often in this country it doesn't. I do think that we probably need elected judges. I think the sentencing committee needs to come under a lot more scrutiny, because clearly their reviews do not match justice. And despite all the tough talk from the Tories, you still have far too many cases of judges enacting ridiculous sentences. And what really bugs me is when the judge will actually acknowledge the heinousness of the crime, and yet they go, it's like when they're sentencing, it's like they have a split personality, because they usually will acknowledge how awful a crime is, and yet they will then come out with something like, it is therefore with much reluctance that I give you a suspended sentence. And I'm thinking that's insincere. If you really believe as a judge that that crime is heinous, you should do your job in a position of power and enact justice. It's not about wanting blood, it's about fairness. And clearly, I have just as much a problem with overtly lenient sentencing as I do with the death penalty. But at my core, I do oppose the death penalty. And you know, if I ever lost a loved one, it might well be that I change my mind. But this is not something that is simple. This is not something that I believe this is one of those subjects people really need to think carefully about before forming a hard opinion on it. You need to look at all the angles, you need to look at both sides. Incidentally, in the US, states that have the death penalty, there's no evidence that they have lower crime than states that don't. So, certainly a deterrent point of view doesn't weigh up, because Texas has the death penalty, and there's absolutely no evidence that Texas is safer than any other state. Okay, I'll leave it there.